In Duskmourn, House of Horror, magic takes us deep into the heart of fear. Today, we'll be exploring the fear enchantment creatures, each representing real-life psychological phobias. And they're not just creatures. These cards are literal nightmares, manifesting the darkest corners of the mind. From primal terrors to modern anxieties, these cards do more than attack out on the battlefield. They tap into some of the most universal human fears. Our first group is the physical fears, and our first card is Fear of Burning Alive. For 4 and 2 red, this 4/4 nightmare deals 4 damage to each opponent when it enters the battlefield. It also has Delirium. Whenever a source you control deals non-combat damage to an opponent, if there are 4 or more card types among cards in your graveyard, Fear of Burning Alive deals that amount of damage to target creature that player controls. Fear of Burning Alive is similar to pyrophobia, the intense fear of fire, where even the thought of flames can cause panic and distress. This card does a nice job of representing the intensity and destructive power of fire. Next up is Fear of Falling, a 4/4 flying nightmare for 3 and 2 blue. Fear of falling is known as acrophobia, an extreme fear of heights, where even looking down from a high place causes overwhelming anxiety. This card has the ability, whenever Fear of Falling attacks, target creature defending player controls gets -2/-0 and loses flying until your next turn. How appropriate that a target defending creature effectively plummets back to the ground when your nightmare attacks. Our next card is Fear of Immobility, a 4/4 nightmare for 4 and 1 white. Fear of immobility is most closely related to paralysis anxiety, the fear of being paralyzed. This fear is tied to being trapped, physically or mentally, without the ability to move or act. When Fear of Immobility enters the battlefield, tap up to 1 target creature. If an opponent controls that creature, put a stun counter on it. If a permanent with a stun counter would become untapped, remove 1 from it instead. This card can immobilize an opponent's creature just long enough for you to enact your game plan. Our next card is Fear of Lost Teeth, a 1/1 nightmare for 1 black mana. Fear of losing teeth, while not a formal fear or phobia, is a symbolic fear that often reflects deeper fears of aging, decay, or losing control over your own body, commonly symbolized in anxiety-related dreams. Whenever Fear of Lost Teeth dies, it deals 1 damage to any target, and you gain 1 life. The fear of losing teeth may not be existential, but it's still anxiety-provoking. When Lost Teeth dies, you deal damage and gain a life. In dreams, you may lose your teeth, but when you wake up, your pearly whites are still intact. We're calling our next group Social and Performance-Related Fears, and our first card is Fear of Failed Tests, a 2/7 blue nightmare for 4 and 1 blue mana. Adicophobia. The fear of failure embodies the intense fear of not meeting expectations. This card's ability states, whenever Fear of Failed Tests deals combat damage to a player, draw that many cards. The ability suggests that as Fear of Failed Tests attacks and exploits the opponent's fear, the controller reaps the rewards, gaining insight and card advantage through their crippling self-doubt. Let's move on to Fear of Exposure, a 5/4 green nightmare with trample for 2 and 1 green mana. This card relates to social anxiety disorder, the fear of being judged or exposed in public. As an additional cost to cast this spell, tap 2 untapped creatures and/or lands you control. The low relative cost of this trampler is sure to invoke anxiety in even your most resilient opponent. Next up is Fear of Imposters, a 3/2 nightmare with flash for 1 and 2 blue mana. This card ties into imposter syndrome, where individuals constantly fear being exposed as a fraud. Its ability states, when Fear of Imposters enters, counter target spell. Its controller manifests dread. Having a spell countered always makes one feel like a fraud. Now doesn't it? Our next card is Fear of Missing Out, a 2/3 nightmare for 1 and 1 red mana. This fear, known as FOMO, stems from anxiety over missing key experiences or opportunities, and became popular as social media grew and people spent more time online. The card reads, when Fear of Missing Out enters, discard a card, then draw a card. It also has Delirium. Whenever Fear of Missing Out attacks for the first time each turn, if there are 4 or more card types among cards in your graveyard, untap target creature. After this phase, there is an additional combat phase. An extra combat phase with a creature you get to untap. Your opponent will definitely feel the pressure of missing an opportunity like that when they're taking damage to the face. Next, we have Fears of Isolation and Loss of Control, and our first card is aptly named Fear of Isolation, a 2/3 flying nightmare for 2 and 1 blue mana. This card represents autophobia, the fear of being alone or isolated from others. As an additional cost to cast this spell, return a permanent you control to its owner's hand. The need to return a permanent mirrors the emotional cost of isolation and loneliness. Next up is Fear of Sleep Paralysis, a 6/6 flying nightmare for 5 and 1 blue mana. This card links to somnophobia, the fear of sleep paralysis, where someone wakes up but is unable to move. The card has Eerie. Whenever Fear of Sleep Paralysis or another enchantment you control enters, and whenever you fully unlock a room, tap up to 1 target creature and put a stun counter on it. Also, stun counters can't be removed from permanents your opponents control. They won't untap if they have stun counters. The ability to keep permanents stunned cleverly reflects the fear of sleep paralysis. Next is Fear of Surveillance, a 2/2 nightmare with vigilance for 1 and 1 white mana. This card plays on scopophobia, the fear of being watched or constantly monitored. Its ability reads, whenever Fear of Surveillance attacks, surveil 1. The card's art and its surveil ability connect it nicely to scopophobia. Finally, we have our most deep-rooted primal and existential fears. And our first card in this group is Fear of Abduction, a 5/5 flying nightmare for 4 and 2 white mana. This card represents cleithrophobia, the fear of being trapped or abducted. The card's text reads, as an additional cost to cast this spell, exile a creature you control. When Fear of Abduction enters, exile target creature an opponent controls. When Fear of Abduction leaves the battlefield, put each card exiled with it into its owner's hand. While this nightmare exiles creatures, much like the fear of being taken away, they do return, offering a sense of hope once the fear is past. Next, we have Fear of Being Hunted, a 4/2 nightmare with haste for 1 and 2 red mana. This card reflects the heightened sense of hypervigilance, often tied to PTSD, where a person feels constantly pursued or under threat. The ability reads, Fear of Being Hunted must be blocked if able. The mechanic forces the opponent to confront this fear head-on, much like the relentless nature of hypervigilance that can't be ignored or escaped. Our next card is Fear of Infinity, a 2/2 flying nightmare with lifelink for 1 colorless, 1 blue, and 1 black mana. This card captures a paraphobia, the fear of infinity or endless existence. Though fear of infinity can't block, it does have eerie. Whenever an enchantment you control enters, and whenever you fully unlock a room, you may return fear of infinity from your graveyard to your hand. A flyer with built-in graveyard recursion can certainly evoke a pyrophobia, an endless existence. Finally, we have Fear of the Dark, a 5/5 nightmare for 4 and 1 black mana. This card taps into nyctophobia, one of the most ancient and primal fears, the fear of the dark and what lurks within it. Its ability reads, whenever Fear of the Dark attacks, if the defending player controls no glimmer creatures, it gains Menace and Death Touch until end of turn. Glimmer creatures, introduced in Duskmourn, are light manifestations of the hopes and determination of Duskmourn survivors. But without these fragile sources of light, the darkness becomes overwhelming, and this nightmare's true power is unleashed, Menace and Death Touch, sealing the fate of those who stand against it. The Fear series in Duskmourn, House of Horror, offers a chilling look into real psychological phobias. From the primal fear of darkness to the modern anxiety of missing out, these cards delve deep into the human experience of fear. Whether on the battlefield or in our own lives, fear can shape our actions and decisions. Thanks for joining us on this eerie journey into the mind, and let us know what you think. Have you experienced any of these fears or phobias? Please be sure to like this video and subscribe to Phantom's Workshop for more dark explorations. Until then.